Nobody at that underground dojo expected what happened next. Not the challengers who walked in with smirks on their faces. Not the students watching nervously from the sidelines. Not even the instructor who had invited Steven Seagal as a guest, hoping for a quiet demonstration. All they saw was a Hollywood actor in his 50s, standing calmly in the center of the mat, hands relaxed at his sides, no tension in his body. Just another celebrity dropping by a martial arts school, probably for publicity, probably for photos. What they didn't know was the truth hidden beneath that calm exterior. The decades of brutal training in Japan. The black belts earned under legitimate masters who didn't hand out ranks for fame. The years spent teaching law enforcement officers how to control violent suspects without killing them. The real combat experience that had nothing to do with choreographed movie fights. 3 fighters entered that room thinking they'd found an easy target. A Hollywood fraud. Someone who played tough on screen but couldn't handle reality. They came prepared to expose him, to humiliate him, to prove that his reputation was nothing but smoke and mirrors built by stunt coordinators and camera angles. They walked in loud, confident, already laughing about how this would go. 5 minutes later, everything they believed about martial arts, about respect, about what real skill looks like, would be shattered on that mat. This wasn't going to be a fight. Fights are messy, chaotic, unpredictable. This was going to be a lesson. The kind you never forget. The kind that changes how you see the world. Because that day, arrogance walked through the door expecting an easy win. And it met something it hadn't prepared for. Authenticity. This is the story of 3 men who thought they knew what a real martial artist looked like. And the moment they realized how dangerously wrong they were, the dojo sat tucked away in a quiet part of Los Angeles, on a street most people drove past without noticing. No flashy signs out front. No celebrity photos plastered on the walls. No merchandise displays or marketing posters promising quick results. Just a simple wooden door with a small plaque that read, Traditional Martial Arts. Inside, the space felt different from commercial gyms. The floors were worn from years of bare feet sliding across them. The walls were plain, decorated only with a few old photographs of masters from decades past. The air smelled faintly of sweat and wood polish. This was a place where serious martial artists came to train, not to get in shape, not to post workout videos online, but to actually learn the craft, the way it had been taught for generations. Steven had been invited by an old friend, a respected sensei who had run the school for over 20 years. They'd trained together in Japan decades earlier, back when both of them were young and hungry to learn from the masters. The invitation wasn't for publicity. It wasn't for a seminar or a paid appearance, just a quiet visit between old training partners, maybe a demonstration for the students, maybe some tea and conversation about the old days. Nothing more. Steven arrived just before the evening class, dressed simply in a black gi that had seen plenty of use. The fabric was soft from washing, the edges slightly frayed, no designer labels, no custom embroidery with his name. He carried a small bag over his shoulder and walked through the door like any other practitioner visiting a dojo. He bowed respectfully at the entrance, a deep bow that showed genuine reverence for the space. Then he removed his shoes carefully, placing them neatly beside the others lined up against the wall, and stepped onto the mat in bare feet. The students training there were focused on their drills. Some practiced breakfalls, their bodies hitting the mat with controlled thuds. Others worked on wrist locks with partners, moving slowly, checking the technique, making adjustments. Most of them didn't recognize Steven at first. To them, he was just another older martial artist visiting their school. Gray hair pulled back, calm expression, quiet movements. But 3 men sitting in the corner noticed immediately. They weren't students of the dojo. They were fighters from a rival gym across town, a place known for its aggressive training methods and competitive attitude. They'd come that evening specifically to challenge the sensei, to test their style against his, to prove that their system was superior. It was the kind of arrogance that sometimes infects martial arts schools. The belief that what you do is the only thing that works, and everything else is outdated or ineffective. When they saw Steven walk in, their eyes lit up with recognition. One of them elbowed his friend and nodded in Steven's direction. "Isn't that the movie guy?" he whispered, not bothering to keep his voice down. "Yeah," another replied, a smirk spreading across his face. "The one who does those fake fight scenes." The third one chuckled quietly. "Aikido, right? The one where they just roll around and pretend to get thrown." They watched Steven bow to the sensei, watched him greet the instructor with warmth and respect, watched him stand quietly to the side as the class continued. To them, this was perfect. Not only would they challenge the sensei today, but they'd also get to expose a Hollywood fraud in the process. What they didn't understand, what most people who haven't trained seriously never understand, is that some actors didn't learn martial arts for the movies. They learned it decades before the cameras ever started rolling. The sensei called the class to attention, students forming a neat line facing him. He raised his hand for silence, and the room went still. Today we have a special guest, he announced, gesturing toward Steven with genuine warmth. This is my old friend and training brother. We studied together in Japan many years ago. Steven bowed to the students. They bowed back respectfully. The sensei continued, his voice carrying pride. He holds a 7th degree black belt in Aikido. He trained directly under some of the greatest masters of our generation. He has dedicated over 40 years to the art. A few students' eyes widened. Whispers of recognition rippled through the group. He's here simply to observe tonight, but if we're fortunate, perhaps he'll share some insights with us later. The students bowed again, deeper this time, understanding they were in the presence of someone with legitimate credentials. But from the corner, one of the 3 challengers scoffed loudly. The sound cut through the respectful silence like a knife. Heads turned. Students exchanged uncomfortable glances. The challenger shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest. Aikido, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. That's not even real fighting, it's just cooperative dancing. A few students stiffened. The sensei's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. Steven didn't react. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, his expression neutral. The challenger's friend leaned back against the wall, joining in. Yeah, I've seen those demonstrations. Everyone just flips around when you barely touch them. It's all staged. The third one nodded, emboldened. My 5-year-old nephew could do Aikido. You just grab someone's wrist and they throw themselves. Nervous laughter from 1 or 2 students who didn't know how to respond. Most stayed silent, eyes darting between the challengers and their sensei. The sensei stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled. You are guests in my dojo. You will show respect, or you will leave. The first challenger stood up slowly, making a show of it. No disrespect to Hollywood and all that, he said, gesturing dismissively toward Steven. But we came here for real martial arts. Not movie stunts and choreography. The room went completely silent now. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Steven's eyes shifted to meet the challenger's gaze. No anger flickered there, no defensiveness. Just calm, steady observation. The look of someone who had seen this kind of posturing before, many times, and knew exactly where it came from. Insecurity dressed up as confidence. I understand your doubt, Steven said quietly, his voice even and measured. Aikido is often misunderstood by people who haven't studied it. The challenger laughed, sharp and mocking. It's not misunderstood, man. It just doesn't work, not against real fighters who actually resist. His 2 friends stood up beside him now, feeding off each other's energy. The dynamic was shifting. What started as disrespect was escalating into something more confrontational. One of them pulled out his phone, holding it up. This is going to be good content. The sensei moved between them and Steven, his patience wearing thin. That is enough. This is not a place for your ego. You will sit down, or you will leave immediately. But the first challenger wasn't finished. He had an audience now. Students watching, a camera recording, and a Hollywood actor standing right in front of him. He stepped closer to Steven, invading the space between them, his chin raised in challenge. You want to prove your art works, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Then prove it. Right here, right now. Let's see if that black belt is real, or if it's just another Hollywood prop. His friends moved up beside him, forming a wall of aggression. The students looked at each other nervously. Some pulled back slightly, sensing danger. Others leaned in, unable to look away. The sensei's hand moved to the challenger's shoulder, ready to physically remove him if necessary. But Steven raised his hand gently, a small gesture that carried unexpected authority. It's all right, he said to the sensei, his voice still calm, still measured. Then he turned back to the challenger. If you truly want to understand what Aikido is, I'll show you. Steven stood still for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the 3 challengers, then to the students watching with wide eyes, then to his old friend the sensei. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over the room. This wasn't the first time someone had challenged him. Over the decades, he'd faced this situation more times than he could count. In dojos in Japan, in training halls across America, in quiet gyms where fighters thought movies were the only thing he knew. Every single time, he'd had to make the same choice: walk away and let people believe what they wanted to believe, or step forward and show them the truth. Walking away was easier, safer. It avoided conflict, avoided the risk of someone getting hurt, avoided feeding into the spectacle these challengers clearly wanted. But walking away also meant letting disrespect stand unchallenged. It meant allowing these men to leave thinking they'd exposed a fraud. It meant the students in this room would doubt what their sensei had taught them about Aikido's effectiveness. And worse, it meant dishonoring the art itself. The art that had been passed down through generations. The art his teachers in Japan had trusted him to represent correctly. Steven had spent over 40 years training, not for movies, not for fame, but because the discipline meant something to him. He'd sat in freezing dojos in Osaka at 5 in the morning, his knees aching on hard wooden floors, learning the basics over and over until they became part of his muscle memory. He'd trained with masters who didn't care about his career, who only cared whether he understood the principles deeply enough to apply them under pressure. He'd studied the philosophy behind the techniques. The idea that true martial arts wasn't about domination, it was about protection, about redirecting aggression without adding more violence to the world. He'd worked with law enforcement officers, teaching them how to control suspects without escalating situations. He'd seen firsthand how Aikido's principles could end confrontations safely, without anyone going to the hospital. His credentials were real, earned through sweat and patience and years of showing up even when it was hard. But credentials on paper meant nothing to people like these challengers. They only understood what they could see with their own eyes. Steven glanced at the sensei again. His old friend's face was tight with concern, not for Steven's safety, but for what might happen to the challengers if they pushed this too far. The sensei knew what Steven was capable of. They'd trained together when both of them were younger, faster, hungrier. He'd felt Steven's technique firsthand. Steven saw the slight nod his friend gave him. Permission, trust, an acknowledgement that sometimes the only way to teach respect is to demonstrate why it matters. He turned his attention back to the challengers. They were young, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Strong, confident in their physical abilities. Probably good fighters in their own system, whatever that was. But confidence built on limited experience is dangerous. It makes you believe you know more than you do. It makes you think that, because something works in your gym against your training partners, it'll work everywhere against everyone. Steven had been where they were once, decades ago, young and certain that his way was the right way. Then he'd met teachers who showed him how much he didn't know, who humbled him, who broke down his arrogance and rebuilt him into someone who understood that martial arts was about constant learning, not proving dominance. These challengers needed that lesson, not because Steven wanted to humiliate them, but because letting them walk out of here, believing their arrogance was justified, would be doing them a disservice. Someone had to show them the difference between real skill and bravado. Better to learn it here on a padded mat, where Steven could control how much force he used, than to learn it on the street where someone might not be so careful. This wasn't about ego. Steven had nothing to prove to himself. He knew what he knew. This was about protecting the integrity of the art, about respecting his teachers, about showing the students watching that discipline and technique matter more than strength and aggression. And maybe, if he did this right, about teaching these 3 young men something valuable before their arrogance got them seriously hurt somewhere else. Steven took a slow breath, centering himself the way he'd been taught. He looked directly at the first challenger and spoke quietly, his voice carrying no anger, no threat, just simple honesty. I don't want to hurt you. But if you truly want to understand what Aikido is, I'll show you. Not to prove anything to you, but to show you what real martial arts looks like. The challenger stepped onto the mat, his movements aggressive, his shoulders squared, his fists already clenched. His 2 friends moved closer, phones raised, ready to capture what they thought would be an embarrassment. The students formed a loose circle around the mat. Some looked nervous. Others couldn't hide their curiosity. A few of the senior students, the ones who'd trained long enough to understand technique, when they saw it, watched with knowing expressions. They'd seen this before. They knew how it would end. Steven walked calmly to the center of the mat. He stood there quietly, his posture relaxed, his hands open at his sides. He bowed to the challenger, a proper bow. Respectful, formal. The challenger didn't bow back. He just stared, trying to intimidate. Steven straightened and met his eyes. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly. The challenger didn't waste time. He came forward fast, closing the distance in 2 quick steps, his right fist driving straight toward Steven's face with serious intent behind it. No holding back. No testing the waters. Just pure aggression meant to end things quickly. Steven moved. Not backward, not side to side in an obvious dodge. Just a subtle rotation of his hips, a slight turn of his shoulders, his head shifting maybe 6 inches to the left. The punch sailed past his ear, missing by the smallest margin. The challenger's momentum carrying him forward into empty space, where Steven had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. The challenger stumbled, his balance broken, his feet crossing awkwardly as he tried to stop himself from falling. He caught himself and spun around, his face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. "Lucky," he muttered, shaking out his hand. A few of his friends from the corner shifted uncomfortably. That hadn't looked lucky. That had looked precise. But the challenger wasn't ready to accept what he'd just seen. He reset his stance, bouncing slightly on his toes now, trying to stay loose and unpredictable. He came in again, this time with a combination. A quick jab to set up distance, followed by a hard cross, then a low kick aimed at Steven's lead leg. Fast, technical. The kind of striking pattern that would overwhelm most people. Steven didn't block the jab. He didn't try to catch the cross. He didn't check the kick. Instead, he moved with the attacks, his body flowing like water around stones. The jab found air. The cross connected with nothing. The kick swept through space where Steven's leg had been but wasn't anymore. And as the challenger's weight shifted forward from the momentum of his own kick, Steven's hand came up, not to strike, but to intercept the extended arm from the cross. His fingers wrapped around the challenger's wrist. Not grabbing, just touching, guiding. In one smooth motion, Steven turned his hips, stepped slightly to the side, and redirected the challenger's forward energy into a spiral. The challenger's arm twisted. His shoulder rotated. His whole body followed the movement because resisting would have torn something. Before he realized what was happening, he was bent forward at the waist, his arm locked straight, his wrist hyperextended, completely controlled by the gentlest pressure from Steven's fingers. Pain shot through his shoulder and elbow, not from force, from position, from his own body being placed in a structure where every joint was compromised. He tried to pull away, but the slightest attempt to move made the pain sharper. Steven held him there. 2 seconds. Long enough for the challenger to feel how completely trapped he was. Long enough for everyone watching to see it. Then Steven released the pressure and stepped back, letting the challenger go. The challenger staggered away, clutching his arm, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. He rotated his shoulder, checking if anything was damaged. Nothing was broken. Nothing was torn. But his arm felt strange, like it had been in a place it wasn't designed to go. He looked at Steven, trying to process what had just happened. Around the mat, the students were completely silent. A few exchanged glances. The senior students nodded to each other, recognizing the technique. The challenger's 2 friends had stopped smirking. One of them lowered his phone slightly. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially when you've built your identity around being tough, around never backing down. The challenger shook his head, trying to reset mentally. He said, his voice tight. Steven remained still, his expression unchanged. "You don't need to." Again, the challenger repeated louder this time, stepping back onto the mat. The sensei moved forward. "That's enough. You've seen what you came to see." But the challenger ignored him. He was locked in now, unable to accept what had happened, convinced that the next attempt would be different. He came at Steven a 3rd time, more aggressive than before, trying to use speed and power to overwhelm the technique. Steven moved through the attack like it was happening in slow motion. A small step here, a turn there. His hands barely touching the challenger's arms, just enough contact to feel where the energy was going and redirect it. This time, Steven guided him into a different lock, one that brought the challenger down to one knee, his wrist bent backward, his elbow compromised, his entire upper body controlled by a grip that felt almost gentle. The challenger's breathing got faster, his eyes widened. Steven held him there for 3 seconds, then released him again. The challenger stood up slowly, backing away, his chest heaving, and that's when his 2 friends stepped forward. They'd been watching from the sidelines, phones out, expecting to see their friend expose a fraud. Instead, they'd watched him get controlled twice without Steven even breaking a sweat. Their egos couldn't handle it. "This is bullshit," one of them said, stepping onto the mat. "He's cooperating. No one fights like that for real." The other friend joined him, moving to flank Steven from the opposite side. The first challenger, still catching his breath, looked at his friends, then back at Steven. And instead of stepping back, instead of accepting the lesson, he moved to the third position, all three of them now, surrounding Steven in a triangle formation. The students gasped. A few stepped back instinctively. The sensei's voice cut through the tension. "Stop this. Now." But the challengers weren't listening anymore. They were too deep in their own narrative, too committed to proving something that didn't need proving. One of them cracked his knuckles. "Let's see how your movie techniques work against three real fighters." The room held its breath, and Steven, standing calmly in the center of three aggressive men, simply nodded once. "If that's what you need," he said quietly. They moved in together, no coordination, no strategy, just three bodies rushing forward at once, each one convinced that numbers would make the difference. The one behind Steven reached him first, grabbing his shoulder with both hands, trying to pull him backward off balance. Steven didn't resist the pull. He moved with it, turning his body into the grip instead of away from it, using the attacker's own pulling force to generate momentum. His hands came up, found the attacker's wrists, and in one smooth circular motion, Steven turned completely around, taking the attacker's arms with him. The sudden reversal of energy sent the man stumbling forward. Steven guided him past, gave a gentle push at the center of his back, and the man went rolling across the mat, tumbling head over heels until he slid to a stop near the wall, not thrown violently, not slammed, just redirected with enough control that he rolled safely and came up unhurt, but completely disoriented. The second attacker came from Steven's left, throwing a wide haymaker punch designed to knock him out cold. Steven saw it coming in his peripheral vision. He ducked under the arm, staying low, and as the punch sailed over his head, he stepped inside the attacker's guard. His hand caught the extended wrist, his other hand found the elbow. And then Steven executed a textbook kote geishi, a wrist-turning technique that spiraled the attacker's hand outward and down, forcing his entire body to follow to avoid having his wrist broken. The man's feet left the ground as he flipped through the air, his body rotating to relieve the pressure on his joint. He hit the mat hard on his back, the air rushing out of his lungs with an audible gasp. Steven kept hold of the wrist, maintaining control, applying just enough pressure to keep the man pinned without injuring him. The third attacker, the original challenger, rushed in from the front, trying to tackle Steven to the ground while he was still controlling the second man. Steven released the wrist at the last possible second and pivoted to the side. The challenger's arms closed around empty air. His momentum carried him forward, off balance, vulnerable. Steven's hand came to rest gently on the back of the challenger's neck, not striking, not choking, just guiding. With a subtle shift of pressure and a step to redirect the energy, Steven executed an irimi nage, entering directly into the attack and using the challenger's own forward momentum against him. The challenger's feet left the mat. His body spiraled through the air in a controlled arc, rotating completely before landing on the mat with a heavy thud. All three attackers were down. The first one was still on his knees near the wall, trying to figure out what had just happened. The second was on his back, staring at the ceiling, his wrists still tingling from the lock. The third, the original challenger, lay flat on the mat, stunned, the wind knocked out of him. The entire sequence had taken maybe 8 seconds. Steven stood in the center of the mat, exactly where he'd started. His breathing was calm, steady, unchanged. Not a single drop of sweat on his forehead. His gi wasn't even wrinkled. He looked down at the three men, his expression still neutral, still controlled. No triumph in his eyes. No satisfaction. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had done exactly what he'd trained 40 years to do. The students around the mat stood frozen, some with their hands over their mouths, others with their eyes wide in disbelief. They'd just watched 3 aggressive fighters attack simultaneously and get neutralized without a single punch being thrown, without anyone getting seriously hurt. One of the senior students whispered to another, "That was real Aikido." The sensei stood near the edge of the mat, arms crossed, his face a mixture of pride and vindication. Steven stepped forward and extended his hand to the original challenger. The man was still on his back, breathing hard, staring up at the ceiling. Steven's hand appeared in his field of vision, palm open, offering help. The challenger looked at the hand, then up at Steven's face. For a moment, pride fought with reality. His ego wanted to refuse. His body wanted to stay down and avoid further humiliation. But something in Steven's eyes stopped him. There was no mockery there, no judgment. Just the simple offer of assistance. The challenger reached up and took Steven's hand. Steven pulled him to his feet effortlessly, steadying him as he found his balance. The other two attackers were getting up on their own now, moving slowly, checking themselves for injuries they were surprised not to find. Steven turned to face all three of them. Aikido doesn't fight force with force, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent dojo. It accepts the attack, redirects the energy, and neutralizes the threat without adding more violence to the situation. He gestured to the three of them, standing there bruised in ego but not in body. You came at me together. You used strength, aggression, numbers, and none of you are injured. That's not because you held back. It's because the art is designed to protect everyone involved, including the attackers. The original challenger looked down at his hands, then at his friends, then back at Steven. His phone, which had been in his friend's hand recording everything, was still pointed at them. And in that moment, something shifted in his expression. The arrogance drained away, replaced by something else. Respect. Real respect. The kind that only comes from experiencing something undeniable. One of the other students checked his phone and his eyes went wide. He said quietly to his friend beside him. That video is live. It's already got like 10,000 views. Another student glanced at her phone. 15,000 now. The notifications were starting to flood in, comments, shares, reactions spreading across the internet in real time. The world was watching what had just happened on that mat, and what they saw wasn't a fight. They saw control, discipline, the embodiment of martial arts done correctly. The three challengers sat on the edge of the mat now, legs crossed, shoulders slumped, trying to process what had just happened to them. Their bodies weren't injured. No broken bones, no torn ligaments, no bruises that would last more than a day or two. But their egos had taken a beating they'd remember for the rest of their lives. The original challenger stared at the floor, his hands resting on his knees. His breathing had returned to normal, but his mind was still racing, replaying every moment of the encounter. He'd come in so confident, so certain that his training, his strength, his aggression would be enough. And in less than 10 seconds, he'd been controlled, locked, and released like a child being corrected by a patient teacher. The worst part wasn't the physical defeat. It was realizing how gentle Steven had been with him. How much restraint it had taken to neutralize three attackers without hurting any of them. That level of control was harder than just fighting back. It required something deeper than technique. It required mastery. One of his friends rubbed his wrist, the one Steven had locked. I couldn't move, he said quietly, almost to himself. I tried to pull away and it just made it worse. The third one nodded slowly. He wasn't even trying. Did you see his face? He wasn't angry, he wasn't scared, he was just there. People who've never been in a real confrontation don't understand how terrifying calm can be. When someone stays composed while you're throwing everything you have at them, when they control you without effort, it breaks something inside your confidence. It shows you that all the aggression in the world doesn't matter if the other person understands principles you haven't even begun to learn. The original challenger finally looked up at Steven, who was now standing with the sensei, speaking quietly. I'm sorry, the challenger said, his voice rough. I was wrong. Steven turned toward him. His expression hadn't changed. Still calm, still neutral. He walked over and knelt down to the challenger's eye level, showing respect even now. You weren't wrong to have doubt, Steven said gently. Doubt is healthy. It keeps you honest. It makes you question what you think you know. He paused, making sure the young man was listening. But you were wrong to confuse doubt with disrespect. You came here to prove something to yourself, and that's fine. But you tried to do it by tearing someone else down. That's where you made your mistake. The challenger nodded slowly, the lesson sinking in deeper than any technique ever could. Steven continued. You also showed courage tonight. You stepped onto the mat when you could have just talked. You tested your beliefs instead of hiding behind them. That takes guts. Now you just need to direct that courage toward growth instead of proving dominance. The young man's eyes were wet now, not from pain but from the weight of understanding something important about himself. Steven stood and offered his hand again. The challenger took it, and Steven pulled him to his feet. "Keep training," Steven said, "but train with humility. That's when real learning happens." The sensei approached, placing a hand on Steven's shoulder. He looked at the three challengers with the stern expression of a teacher who just watched his students learn a hard lesson. "This," he said, gesturing to Steven, "is what real martial arts looks like. It's not about flash. It's not about being the toughest person in the room. It's about control, discipline, and protecting everyone involved, even the people attacking you." He let that sink in before continuing. "You three came here tonight thinking you'd expose a fraud. Instead, you exposed your own ignorance. I hope you're wise enough to learn from it." The challengers nodded, unable to meet his eyes. One of the students near the wall was still staring at his phone, watching the numbers climb. 50,000 views, he whispered. Another student checked her screen. "It's on 3 different platforms now. People are sharing it everywhere." By the time everyone left the dojo that night, the video had passed 100,000 views. By the next morning, it was in the millions. News sites picked it up. Martial arts forums dissected every technique. Self-defense instructors used it in their classes as a teaching tool. The comments sections were flooded, not with people celebrating a fight, but with people recognizing something they'd rarely seen before. Real martial arts, applied correctly, with restraint, with purpose. Law enforcement trainers shared it with their departments, pointing out how Steven had controlled multiple aggressive individuals without injuring anyone. That's what they needed their officers to learn. De-escalation through superior technique, not escalation through superior violence. Aikido schools around the world saw enrollment increase. People who dismissed the art as impractical suddenly wanted to understand how it worked. The 3 challengers who'd started it all became part of the story whether they wanted to be or not. Some comments mocked them. Others praised them for having the courage to challenge their assumptions, even if it meant being humbled publicly. One of them posted a response video a week later. He sat in front of the camera, still processing everything, and spoke honestly. "I was arrogant," he said. "I thought I knew what real fighting looked like. I was wrong. What Steven Seagal showed us wasn't movie tricks. It was decades of real training. And I'm grateful he was skilled enough to teach us without hurting us." The video got shared almost as much as the original, because people respond to authenticity, to growth, to seeing someone admit they were wrong and choose to be better. Steven never commented publicly on any of it. He didn't need to. The demonstration had spoken for itself. But that night in the dojo proved something the world needed to see. Real skill doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to trash talk or posture or prove itself through violence. Real skill is quiet, controlled, precise. It ends confrontations without creating victims. It protects without destroying. And real martial arts isn't about winning fights. It's about making sure nobody has to lose. That's the lesson that went viral. That's the message that spread across millions of screens. Not because of spectacle, but because of truth. We've got more incredible stories coming your way. Real moments, real people, real lessons. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it the moment the 3 attackers rushed Steven at once? The way he controlled them without hurting them? Or the challenger's apology afterward? Your feedback helps us bring you better stories. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you believe that real mastery is shown through control, not chaos, type recipe in the comments.